Welcome to week 5 of the painting challenge to improve your watercolor landscapes. This week, I've been expanding my knowledge of watercolor skies. I've painted a slew of clouds, a couple of sunsets, and of course, the night sky full of stars. I'm not afraid to admit skies can be challenging, and some of the so-called beginner techniques didn't leave me with the results I'd hoped for. So today, I'm going to share a bit about what I've learned this week, and I'll show you a 4-step approach to watercolor clouds. It's been working for me, and if you've been looking for an easy way to paint clouds, I think it'll work for you too. Let's go ahead and get started. First, I'm going to show you 3 photographs all taken on cloudy days. Let's take note of 2 things. Number 1, cloud shapes. Clouds aren't uniform and they certainly aren't perfectly round on all sides. Their shapes are quite random, some having more form than others. And number 2, let's look at the color. They aren't plain white and they usually have much darker shades towards the bottom. Let's keep those 2 things in mind as we paint and give ourselves some leeway if our clouds don't look picture perfect, because when it comes to nature, perfection doesn't exist. Everything is perfectly imperfect, and that's precisely why we can't get enough of it. So step 1, we're painting the sky. I've wet down my paper with the help of a misting spray bottle and a large brush. I'm coming in with some blue, spreading it across my entire paper. Today I'm using Prussian blue at the top and cerulean blue at the bottom, but I think you can get away with pretty much any color, even outside of the blues, keeping in mind that the sky generally gets lighter as you get closer to the horizon. I'd like to take a moment to mention the shape of the paper I'm working on. I normally purchase 9 by 12 inch pads of watercolor paper, 140-pound cold pressed. It's great quality, but can be pricey, so I like to cut my paper down into smaller portions. Because I'm in full learning mode, it makes more sense for me to get multiple tries out of each piece, so I'll either cut them down to size or I'll tape off different sections. That way, I feel like I have the freedom to experiment and make mistakes without worrying about how much I'm spending on paintings that might wind up in the trash bin. I want to make sure the sky is dark enough to create some contrast when we add our clouds. I've noticed that the paper has soaked up quite a bit of our color, so I'm adding another layer. Step 2. Lift the paint with tissue paper to create clouds. Now, while the paper is still wet, I'm using a rolled up piece of tissue paper and I'm just lifting away the paint. I'm going to keep these clouds somewhat subtle, so I'm just dabbing. I'm not pressing too hard. I think I'll go for some larger, puffy cumulus clouds towards the top, and I'll make some long, wispy stratus clouds down low in the sky. I really am enjoying these long horizontal strips of paper. I thought they would just be perfect for this week's subject, giving me plenty of room to focus on the sky. It can be surprisingly fun to mix up your paintings a bit with different sizes and shapes of paper. I find that it helps me think outside of the box when it comes to planning the layout of my project. Because the paint is wet, it will bleed back into the lifted area some, so depending on how defined you want your clouds, you may need to go back in and dab again. If you notice a lot of paint on your tissue paper, grab a new one so the color doesn't get pressed into the white area. Step 3. Soften the clouds with a damp piece of tissue paper. So I've tried a similar cloud technique in the past using a paintbrush to soften the edges, but I actually wound up creating those cauliflower blobs because my brush was too wet. So through a lot of experimenting this week, I found that taking a barely damp piece of tissue paper and applying it lightly to the edges, I can soften the look without fear of overwetting. It's funny how one tiny drop of water has the power to spread out over your paper and wind up causing big problems. Now, sometimes you can just dab the water with a dry piece of tissue and save it in time, but I'd rather just avoid the mess to begin with. Now we'll let this dry before moving on to our last step. In the meantime, here's an example of how lifting more of that color can create bright, vibrant clouds. And of course, a darker sky color will result in even more contrast. So there are many possibilities depending on the look you're trying to achieve. Step 4. Adding shadows and shape. Okay, for this step, I'm going to re-wet the clouds only. We don't want to add water to our blue sky. Now I'm using a fine tip brush and adding a nice blue-gray to the lower portion of the clouds, as well as anywhere else that I want to add depth and shape. I'm using a somewhat curvy motion, which gives the clouds a rounded look. I'll move from one cloud to the next, focusing on the underside. As I work on these clouds, I'm going to show you one of my paintings from this week over on the right. At first glance, I think it turned out pretty decent, but let's zoom in and learn from a mistake that I made and really should have known better. I wanted the blues of my skies darker, so I decided to add more paint. The problem was my paper was no longer wet, and it wasn't dry either. It was in that damp in-between period where you really need to use great care if you want to proceed. Take a look at how my colors failed to blend in some areas and actually started to lift in others. Not what I was going for. Now let's zoom in on another part where I added paint to an already wet area. See the results? We have beautiful bleeding and the transition between colors is much smoother. This is something I'm trying to work on, not to play around in that damp in-between stage unless it's with specific intention. Remember, the clouds are wet, so the color we're seeing now will soak in and fade to a much lighter value. As I move on to these wispy clouds, my motions will be small flicks, and they won't be nearly as curved. I want to leave most of these clouds white, so I'm just barely touching the bottom portion. Now, this is the point where I would usually stop because I like my clouds to be quite subtle, fading into the background of my landscapes. But for today, let's see if we can take this a little further, since the sky is our only subject in this case. I'm going back in with that same blue-gray, but darker in value, and I'm hitting just the very bottom of those curved areas. I don't want to repaint the entire portion that we painted before, just towards the bottom. By coming back in like this, adding more layers and darker values, you can easily create as much or as little shape as you want. I'm just going to have some fun at this point and make these puffy cloud shapes a little more exaggerated than I normally would. Okay, let's go ahead and remove the tape and see the close-ups. I appreciate you joining me today, and I hope you'll give these 4 steps a try. I'll see you in week 6 of the painting challenge to improve your watercolor landscapes. All next week, I'll be painting bodies of water, lakes, creeks, and the sea. Thanks for watching.